Hello, my name is Matt Kondratieff. I'm an aquatic research scientist from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and I'm just excited to be here with you today virtually to talk a little bit about fundamentals of fish habitat restoration. I just want to share just real brief. I want to thank Dr. Chris Myrick for inviting me to give this lecture and participate with you today. Chris was actually somebody who was very influential in my life in terms of my fisheries career. I first met Chris a long time ago, and at UC Davis was kind of where we spent most time together. And then I followed Chris out to Colorado from California to be his first graduate student. So I'm really honored that I could be able to share some of the things that I do on a daily basis in terms of stream restoration with fish in particular, and hopefully communicate some principles to you that you'll find useful and helpful as you're kind of surveying the different possibilities and opportunities that exist in the fisheries realm. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started with this lecture and share some of the things that I've learned about fish habitat and some of the principles that I've found very helpful. So in terms of thinking about fish populations and restoration, it helps to have a conceptual diagram, in my mind, a framework that helps with an understanding of what makes up good fish habitat. So many times when we think about restoring fish habitat, the first thing we do is think about biology, like how many fish, what's the biomass or the density of fish in a stream, in this case, a stream environment. And so that's kind of the end point, and many of the goals in fish habitat restoration involve biology. But however, it's important to realize that before we can get to biology, there's a lot of different stages or steps that we have to have in place in order to have a healthy, functioning population. So this is a conceptual diagram that I found that was developed by Will Harmon with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the way it works is at the basis of fish habitat, you have hydrology, or simply water. You've got to have water, and hydrology describes in a stream the pattern of flows over time. So for instance, in Colorado, we have a dominant snowmelt hydrology. So we have peak flows that occur like in May through July, typically. We get our large peak flows, and then the rest of the year we can have kind of a typically more stable, steady stream discharge. So if you looked at discharge plotted against time, you'd see a giant spike in that kind of May through July timeframe. So hydrology is like a description of the pattern of flows that you typically find in a stream. The hydraulics are what are the forces in a stream channel, and how do those dynamic forces operate to create and kind of maintain the topography of the system or the morphology of the channel. So hydraulics are interactions of flow with the bed of the channel. You can think about vegetation providing resistance, wood, as well as how attached a stream is to its floodplain and adjacent floodplain. Those are all part of hydraulics in channels. Geomorphology, that's a kind of a fancy term for what is the shape of the actual channel? What does it look like? And that can be in cross section. So looking, if you took a stream and you kind of chopped it into small segments in terms of a cross section, or in terms of longitudinal profile, which is like if you go from upstream to downstream and you looked at how much variability there is in the stream bed. Are there deep valleys, which would represent pools, or are there kind of steep mountains that would represent a glide? And then obviously the downhill portions of the stream, the long downhill portions are the riffles. So geomorphology, that's kind of a description in basic terms. What I've done is very basic, but it can get very much more complicated. What is the actual physical habitat of the channel composed of or look like? Physicochemical describes the actual water chemistry, dynamics and properties of water itself, like water temperature, hardness, pH. It can be things like heavy metal toxicity. Those are all aspects of water chemistry that are important. And then finally, once we've gotten all those things squared away, if we still are within the parameters and ranges that are acceptable for fish physiological tolerances, we can get to biology. And that's where biology is often the place, as I mentioned, where many people go to first. But I like this diagram because before you can get to thinking about stream restoration, you better understand all the other basics, the foundational principles that underlie the biology of the system, because these are physical characteristics primarily that will dictate what can live in a stream channel. And if there's anything that doesn't quite get up work, you might have what we consider a limiting factor. A limiting factor is simply, if you think about this conceptual diagram, is there any place in this diagram that falls short of providing the habitat necessary for fish to survive? So for instance, maybe there's a heavy metal contaminated section of a river and it has too high zinc concentrations. Well, that could limit the ability for trout to live there. And therefore it's a limiting factor to the trout being able to occupy that habitat. So fish populations are really interesting because they can be useful as an ecological indicator. And what that basically means is, you've all heard the term, the canary in the coal mine, how that was used to be a way that miners would tell if there was sufficient oxygen levels deep in the earth when they were mining. Well, trout or fish populations are kind of like keystone species or a type of indicator species that can tell us about the health of a stream system. So if we have, in theory, if we have a healthy fish populations, depending on the species we're talking about, they can often provide us evidence that there might be sufficient food, for instance, in the form of macroinvertebrates, leaf litter, algae, and even things like streamside riparian conditions that would provide habitat for terrestrial insects, invertebrates, lizards, birds, and bats. All of those things interact, and fish kind of are one of the important ecological indicator species for telling us the health of that system. When we're talking about how to improve fish populations, there's actually three major tools in a biologist or manager's toolbox, a fish manager's toolbox. We can either do things like stock a stream, where we have hatcheries that produce fish, and then we're able to artificially place those fish into the stream and supplement existing populations, or in some cases, start brand new ones by stocking these fish, and then hoping that they will provide recreational benefits or other, or potentially kickstart a population in an area that might have been, for some reason, habitat conditions were limiting, and now they've been addressed so that fish can live there. Also, we can adjust regulations. So in terms of, it turns out that humans are pretty powerful in their ability to influence fish populations. So in terms of our harvesting abilities, so if, for instance, we have limitations on the number of fish that are recruiting to a stream, meaning that we don't have, maybe we have too few reproductively mature adults to create new offspring to improve the population in future generations. One thing we can do is we can adjust regulations, for instance, by creating limits that protect the large, more mature, reproductively mature individuals in a population. So the larger fish, by setting regulations like a limited number of fish that can be harvested at these larger sizes. So fish regulations are a way that we can improve fish populations. And then finally, we can also do it using habitat. And that's what we're going to focus on today through my lecture, I hope, is to introduce you to some ideas related to habitat and how habitat can be useful as a way to improve fish populations. Habitat's a little different than stocking or regulations in that what we're trying to do is influence carrying capacity And by theoretically us being able to increase carrying capacity by changing the quality of the habitat conditions, we should be able to improve that population in terms of numbers or biomass, or basically the size distribution or composition of, or species composition of a channel. So before we get into stream habitat restoration, I want to talk about the basics of stream habitat. First of all, you've got to have a place for fish, for a fish population to thrive. You need adequate spawning habitat. That's places for them to reproduce. So we know from experience that trout, for instance, really like cold, clear water. They really prefer larger diameter kind of gravel substrates. Depending on the species, they select different sizes. These are bull trout from Montana. But you know, these salmonids prefer certain size substrate, gravel material that they find in cold water temperatures and upwelling conditions. That's basically water that will percolate vertically up through the gravels to oxygenate the eggs. In addition to reproductive habitat or spawning, we got to have adequate food. Fish need to have forage areas to feed. So that includes things like cobble material in riffles that might be providing habitat for macroinvertebrates for trout, or it might be riparian vegetation that provides terrestrial insects that drop off the vegetation into the channel and provide forage. It can be any number of those different things. But most commonly for salmonids and trout, we are looking at riffle quality. So some of the biggest enemies to having a healthy riffle, where macroinvertebrates, things like stoneflies, mayflies, caddisflies can occur, is sedimentation. So fine sediment can settle in riffles, and as it settles and deposits, it can clog up the interstitial spaces that provide homes for those aquatic insects. So in a healthy stream, we hope to have clear, kind of clean interstitial gaps where those aquatic invertebrates can thrive. The last piece is refuge from harsh environmental extremes. So that's things like droughts, like we're kind of experiencing in the moment, low flow type of refugia, as well as high flow type refugia in floods. So environmental extremes from environmental kind of catastrophic events. So sometimes these catastrophic events are not natural. We can sort of have artificial effects, for instance, of drought from diverting water. This is a diversion in the upper Arkansas River on Half Moon Creek. And notice this water diversion is taking 100% basically of the water, creating very little, almost 100%. I guess there's a little trickle coming down, but not very much water left downstream. So a trout living downstream of this diversion is going to have a hard time and experience what we consider low flow, issues with low flow and needing low flow refugia. In contrast, back in 2013, if you were around the Front Range, we had some massive flooding. This is just below Estes Park and the Big Thompson River, and what it looked like during the 2013 flood. Notice the area to the right of the photo. There's that huge area of water that's inundating a floodplain. That is what is really important about for fish to find places to escape the crazy hydraulic forces that are going on in the main channel. You can see all the frothy, turbulent water. They can get out and occupy a floodplain where velocities are much lower. They can potentially survive an event like this high flood that was just like a 1,000-year flood event. So in terms of these habitats, it's important to think about how they change on both a time or temporal as well as spatial scales. So first of all, it's good to know that fish can move on a daily, seasonal basis, or in response to stochastic events like flooding and droughts. Also, the movements of fish are affected in terms of their frequency and distance, depending on what the species is, the age of the fish, and the resources that are available within the stream. Habitats can be many miles apart, so spatially can be very separate, or, they can also be and because of that, they can types of barriers can be very destructive toward interrupting the ability of fish to maintain their ability to find food, spawning habitat, or refuge. So for instance, we put in a dam or a low head diversion or culverts, or sometimes whitewater parks, as we found, these can create barriers to fish moving and finding the ability to find these different parts of components of their kind of life cycle that are necessary to maintain the fish population. It's also important to think about scale when you're thinking about fish habitat. So everything from large scale, like an entire watershed, as you see at the top of this diagram, all the way down to micro habitat scales when we're looking at individual rock structures, riffles, or pools. And you're going to see a little bit of how those aspects interact in the presentation, some of the case studies that I share today. So first of all, Colorado is unique in that we really have, for a mountain headwater state, we have some real nice aquatic fish diversity in terms of fish populations. Not necessarily in terms of the number of species, but more related to the diversity of habitat types. So for instance, in the Eastern Plains, we have a number of native fish that occur there, like darters and minnows, some catfish, native catfish, and also sunfish. So different species that live out in the Eastern Plains. Many of these fish are not necessarily great at jumping, vertical jumps and obstacles, because the way they've evolved, they live in these low gradient systems where if the river encounters an obstruction of flow that would normally induce like a waterfall or sort of a vertical obstacle that a fish would have to jump, the river simply cuts around it because it's got a soft vegetated bank, typically, that fish or that the stream can adjust by cutting around. So these fish aren't typically real great jumpers. In contrast to that, also we have transition zone stream fish that are kind of unique, like common shiner, red side shiner. These are some fish that live in that transition from the steep gradient mountain streams as you get, and then as it goes into the Eastern Plains, the low gradient kind of lazy river systems. And then up above that in elevation, we have the mountain streams. That's where we have a number of native cutthroat trout that are subspecies, as well as mountain suckers, or the three species as we call them, and occupy some of these higher gradient streams. And these fish are typically a little bit better at jumping and tolerating high velocities and more turbulent hydraulic conditions. We have the Rio Grande rivers and streams in the southern half of the state, where we find Rio Grande chub and Rio Grande suckers that are kind of unique. And then the Colorado Basin or Plateau Wyoming Basin streams, which are kind of typical of intergorge systems, kind of like the Grand Canyon, miniature versions of that. These are more flashy, drier places that but that get really high velocities. They're very confined channels in these intergorge kind of canyon environments. So you'll notice that the fish morphologies, body types, have some unique adaptations that allow them to live in really high velocity, raging kind of stream conditions, since they live in these canyon systems. So even some of the fish morphology characteristics are similar to those found in tuna, with a narrow caudal peduncle and these kind of keelbacks and things like that. So things like razorback sucker, humpback chub, and Colorado pike minnow are some examples of those fish that occupy those types of systems. And Chris is wonderful at explaining some of the morphological characteristics and how they relate to the hydrology, the characteristics of the environment from which you find them. So if you have more questions about some of those neat adaptations of these different Colorado fishes, you should ask him, because he's great at explaining that, and I don't have time today. So one of the ways that we do channel restoration is to use a reference reach, and it's simply a simple approach. What we really are doing is we're taking the characteristics that we find in a healthy stream environment that's of a similar stream gradient, often a similar discharge in terms of position in a watershed, elevational range, those kind of characteristics. And we can take the information from a healthy stream reach and then transfer that information to an impaired one. So if we've got a system that's sort of out of whack for whatever reason, maybe from historically, we've channelized the river, we've disconnected the stream from its floodplain. We're trying to figure out, well, what elevation should we make the floodplain? How steep should the channel be? How much wiggle room, or we call it sinuosity, should we provide in our design? How much large rock or what size material would you expect? How much wood will you expect in the channel? These are all things we can get from our reference reach, and then we can use that information, transfer it to our impaired section. That'll lead us to a design that should hopefully fulfill and be sustainable over time. So some of the fundamentals, we call this natural channel design, but you have your existing stream. This is a picture from a stream in South Park in the middle of the state or so, just kind of west of Colorado Springs. This is the South Platte River, and it has a legacy of overgrazing and basically willows being stripped of the banks. So the channel's in a very overwide type of state. So we want to help create some lateral stability and improve the ability of willows to get reestablished. So, but the existing state is impaired. We go to a section of river upstream that has a healthy willow community, and it has a lot of the processes that are that we have identified as lacking in our existing impaired site. We use the information from the reference reach, and then we combine the data from the reference reach to help put that impaired or existing condition back on track toward developing the processes that would lead it to becoming more of a healthy stream. So I talked about the stream function pyramid and limiting factors. I'm going to have a couple case examples to show you how this kind of relates in terms of actual research that we've done, monitoring different aspects of these sort of fundamentals of the stream function pyramid, this concept of how do you, if you want to improve fisheries, you've got to deal with these fundamental aspects that are underlying biology. So for instance, under hydraulics and hydrology, I got an example of a recent stream restoration project we did on Clear Creek. Clear Creek is a stream that runs along I-70 near Idaho Springs. And you can see that the left photo shows that the stream was a very ditched, kind of channelized system with riprap banks. We were able to work with CDOT, and we came up with a solution to restore this reach to make an active channel with a new floodplain. You can see on the right there. So I'm going to give you some examples of fish data from this project. So this is, again, an example of what the stream looks like. There's I-70 running in this photo on your right-hand side, and then there's Clear Creek. That's a ditched, channelized stream that's unfortunately been forced to live between the Interstate 70, which is like in places 6 lanes wide, and then old historic railroad on the other side, and human development with houses, etc. So you know where Idaho Springs is. I won't spend too much time on that, but there was this little stretch of stream that ran next to the twin tunnels that, again, is near Idaho Springs, and we had an opportunity to do a project there. But we cut this project in half and did 2 different treatment approaches, upstream and downstream, and I'll explain what that looks like. So in terms of restoration goals, the main goals were, first, we wanted to remove that armored riprap off the banks to try to make this a more natural channel and not lock the channel in place. We wanted to improve floodplain connectivity by establishing and actually constructing a floodplain. We wanted to convert a single stage, meaning just a single channel that holds all, it's expected, like a cross section that's expected to hold all the discharge at all different levels with no floodplain involved, to what we call a 3-stage channel. I'll explain that a little more clearly in a second, right here. So here's an example of a single stage channel, essentially a trapezoidal ditch type geometry that one single cross section here is expected to accommodate all the range of flows from high floods to the smallest little drought base level discharge. So notice armored banks, low bed form diversity in this stream. It transports sediment well, but you don't see any real obvious pools and riffles. It's all just kind of a one single gradient long ditch. No riparian vegetation, and you have a disconnected floodplain. In contrast to that, the three-stage channel has this low elevation, low flow or inner berm channel we call the thalweg of the channel, which just means, again, that lowest elevation portion of the channel. That's where a lot of the flows during drought conditions are concentrated in a smaller cross-sectional area, and fish can survive under extreme drought because of that. Then you have the bankfold stage channel. That's the flow that's kind of the flood flow that occurs every 2 out of 3 years on average for a stream, and it's found to be like essentially the dimension of that cross section is everything from the floodplain and lower. Imagine, so everything from the floodplain elevation and lower in elevation is considered bankable. Then you have flood prone area, which is just the active floodplain that starts at what we consider the start of when floodwaters just barely begin to start to come out onto the floodplain, and then activates up to about a 25-year event. So that also one of the goals was to establish riparian vegetation. You saw from my prior photographs of just riprap banks, and then enhance in-channel bed form features. So create velocity cover, depth cover, and hopefully develop some spawning areas in the stream. So at first we wanted to do this for the whole project area, which was about 0.6 of a mile. But after the project began, we found that there were some constraints that didn't allow us to develop the floodplain in the lower half of the project reach. But what that did is allowed us to create a kind of a neat research opportunity to compare the performance of how fish did in an area where we developed the floodplain compared to an area where we had no ability to change the floodplain. So downstream of this bridge, you notice about 2/3 of the way downstream of the reach, it says bridge there. That was where we demarcated the division between a low intensity reach, as we call it, and the high intensity reach. And I'll describe what that means. So here's a picture of the low intensity reach. Notice that it's got no floodplain. It's just these steep banks transitioning down to the channel edge. The channel itself is pretty monotypic. It doesn't have a lot of bed form diversity in terms of pools, riffles. It's got a little bit of a pool, but very shallow pool habitat. So that's the low intensity reach downstream of the bridge. And what we were able to do there is just add some structures that would hopefully enhance those pools, create some habitat diversity and velocity refuge. So the yellow circles on here designate boulders that were placed in the channel. You can see where we excavated a pool. Those are the dark blue ovals. Those are pools that were added and excavated. And then a structure known as a cross vein was the first structure downstream of the bridge, and a few other minor things like some wood and a side channel, but not a whole lot beyond that. We couldn't actually do anything about floodplain. So this is the low intensity stretch before, what it looked like. This is what it looked like after. So what we did is, again, just did some excavating to create deeper pools, put in some structures like cross veins, which are just upstream facing V-shaped structures to concentrate flows and enhance pools. And then the side channel that you see on river left downstream on the left side of the photo, we placed some large wood to help develop sort of some juvenile rearing conditions. This is a cross section showing before and after what the stream channel was like. So the pre-construction survey is the pink line, the black is the post-construction or after restoration. It's just showing that we didn't do anything to the actual cross-sectional to change the cross-section itself. So no effort was placed to build a floodplain or anything, just putting in structures. So in terms of the summary of what we did for development of this reach, the low intensity reach, we really have, the big thing I'm pointing out is that no effort was made to build a floodplain. So what we found when we were monitoring, we had monitoring data from 3 years before the project and 5 years post-project. The purple bars are the pre-project years. The post construction after we did restoration work are the orange bars. And notice brown trout density or number per mile is on the y-axis. So you can see for density, the number of fish per mile, we did see an improvement, slight improvement in fish numbers before and after. We had about twice the number of brown trout after we did work in this stretch of stream when we compare before to after. When we looked at brown trout biomass, which is just the pounds of brown trout per acre in this section before and after, purple being before, orange after, you'll see there's been about 1.8 times more brown trout in this section that when I compared the post-restoration to pre-restoration conditions. So putting in the structures, just the boulders, did improve the number of trout per mile and the pounds of trout per mile in this stretch by those amounts. Now upstream, we had a little different, more flexibility. So this again is very similar to actually the low intensity site in terms of stream gradient and what the existing conditions were like. Same kind of stream type, single stage channel. But with CDOT's help, we were able to get approval to remove all the riprap, get rid of, rebuild a floodplain, create a 3-stage channel with a low elevation inner berm or thalweg, and we converted it to actually a different stream type. So from a single stage channel to a 3-stage channel was a big change. We had to remove many, many thousands of cubic yards of material to be able to do this. And then all those areas that are adjacent to the stream will be planted with vegetation. So this was what we call the high intensity reach. This is just showing an overview of what was done. We put in a J hook at the lower end, that largest blue oval, and the downstream port. That's just, it's like a cross vein, but it focuses energy into the pool to maintain the deeper pool conditions. The yellow spots are boulders, and then micro pools behind those little boulder mini veins. So a high intensity slight beforehand, after what it looked like. And then these are the cross sections. Notice again, the pink line is the before cross section. The black is the after condition, after we did restoration. And notice that the channel now has a floodplain, this low elevation adjacent features next to the active channel. The lowest area is the active channel, building up to a floodplain and then up to terraces. So we have vastly improved the amount of area for floodwaters to expand. And what it does is it will maintain lower energy conditions in the active channel that the fish can survive in under those high flow scenarios. So what did we find? We put 100% of our effort into the floodplain and building a floodplain. We also did work on adding habitat boulders and other features, but the primary work was on building floodplain. So what happened when we compare that with the low intensity reach? So this is brown trout density. We had 2 years of monitoring data in this case before construction compared, and then 5 years of post-project monitoring. The purple's before, orange is after. And notice we had almost a three times the number of brown trout as opposed to twice the number of brown trout in terms of the density from before and after when we put in a floodplain. And this is literally only hundreds of yards upstream from where we actually did that low intensity project. So it's very close in space. When we looked at biomass, it was even a bigger change. Brown trout biomass is plotted on the y-axis in pounds per acre, purple before, orange is after, and we had a 422% increase in brown trout biomass, the pounds of brown trout per acre, which is over 5 times the number of brown trout in the reach that we had treated in terms of building in a new floodplain, connecting the floodplain to the channel. So massive improvement there, especially compared to just adding structures and not addressing the floodplain connectivity issue. So that covers hydrology. Hydraulics, geomorphology. This is some data from some work we've just recently done in South Park with the help of Tyler Swar, another grad student that worked with Chris Myrick. We're looking at the response of trout populations and pool depths to large wooden streams. So we're working in South Park, like I said, near Hartselle. We did a habitat evaluation of the South Platte here. This is that stretch I was telling you about where historically willows were removed. The channel's massively over widened. We have very shallow pools, and the primary limiting factor we identified likely is overwinter habitat or deep pools for fish to live in to survive the winters, because South Park's at about 9,000 to 10,000 feet of elevation. It's pretty harsh winters up there, and the rivers ice over. And if they don't have deep pools, it can be a real challenge for fish to make it. So in this case, we had about 1.6 miles of stream that we identified for stream restoration opportunities. And what we did was we did some pools that we treated by excavating the pool, developing a point bar as you see here, and then really that was the extent of what we did in terms of treatment approach. So we didn't do anything to add any wood to these streams. It was just excavating the pool, developing point bar. Another treatment we used was called towwood, and towwood, all it is really putting huge root wads, ponderosa pines or other conifer species, that we weave into the banks in a haphazard type way to protect the bank against the forces, shear stress forces that we get at flood flows. So we weave these large trees in place. They create protection at the toe of the bank. Then we place a brush layer. This is what it looks like during the phases of construction. So here's the large wood that these guys are getting woven in place in the banks. These are giant trees with root wads. This is what this bank looked like before they got going with construction. Here's them placing those logs. And that's what it looks like after they placed a bunch of green brush on top of the logs, and then backfilling with fine sediment material that goes on top of the brush. And then finally, we add sod mat on top as a final approach. And this is what it looks like from a fish habitat standpoint when it's dewatered. So this is what that towwood looks like. It's got a lot of complexity, these giant root wads and underwater. And then finally, this is kind of some finished product of what it looks like. The large wood, you don't hardly see it because it's all submerged. So that's what the haphazard treatment looks like. Okay, and then we had one other treatment we were interested in, and that was an undercut towwood treatment. So that's using the same type of wood, the large ponderosa pines with root fans, but building it to really emphasize or create an undercut. And I'll show you what that looks like here. So here's the large wood. It's placed over what we call a footer log, and the large root fans are suspended over the footer logs by about 6 to 8 feet and create this undercut bank. Then we do the same thing as I showed before. We would place brush on top of that, large wood, and then fine sediment material, and then sod mats that we import from the floodplain as a final product. So this is a before picture of a lateral bend. It was very over wide. This is after we used the large wood to start creating a base, those root fans kind of extending over the kind of telephone pole footer logs. This is what it looks like in terms of what those root fans, the kind of complexity that was formed there. And then this is it after we've placed the brush, the fine sediment, and the final sod transplants. So we wanted to look at all three of these treatments and ask ourselves, well, which of these pools are providing the best habitat for fish? And we're going to use biomass and density as our metrics to measure that. So we identified all the pools that we've done work on. U stands for undercut treatment, NW stands for no wood, H stands for the haphazard treatment. Then we randomly selected 3 of each of those different treatment types within the reach, and we sampled those pools. And the way we did it is we set up block nets upstream and downstream, and then we electrofished using 2 to 3 pass depletion, and then estimated fish numbers in each of these different pool types. So we weighed and measured each of the fish and identified species. It was pretty standard stuff. And then we were able to ask these questions. First of all, which treatment type was most effective at maintaining the deepest pools? Remember, I said the limiting factor we identified was deep pools in this environment, this particular environment, because of the fact that the stream was so over wide. We couldn't seem to get, so we figured that one of the most important things was how do we get overwinter habitat for these fish by maintaining deep pools. So this is a plot of the different, all the different treatments we measured. There's a sample size of 3 in each of these different treatment groups, non-wood, haphazard, and undercut. And we found that both haphazard and undercut towwood treatments were significantly deeper than the non-wood pools. So we were able to demonstrate that, yes, if we use towwood, we can establish deeper pool habitat. And if because we didn't find a difference between undercut and haphazard treatments, we combined those and we estimated about 1.6 foot deeper pools that in the wood and type of pools compared to non-wood. So we also want to ask the question, what's the population response of trout to the introduction of large wood? So we looked at, in this case, brown trout abundance or density. What we found is that the wood treated pools had 2.4 times higher number of brown trout than the non-wood pools. So that was important. We found, wow, that's a benefit with brown trout occupying at higher numbers, increased carrying capacity in the wood type of pools. And then finally, we were interested in one other metric, which was brown trout biomass. Brown trout biomass, which is the pounds of brown trout per acre. And that was pretty extraordinary too. We found that the wood type of pools, the pools where we introduced wood, had 10 times higher biomass than the non-wood pools. I'm sorry, it wasn't the last metric. There's one more, and we were interested in the quality size brown trout. And that quality fish is defined as a 14-inch or longer brown trout. So for fish that were 14 inches or longer, the number of 14-inch or longer fish per 100 foot of pool, we had 28 times higher number of quality size brown trout in the wood type of pools as compared to the non-wood. Then we asked the question, were there any differences between the two different large wood treatments, the haphazard undercut? And the answer to this, these are 95% confidence intervals on these estimates. If they overlap, then there's no evidence. So for trout biomass, we did not find any evidence of a difference. Max pool depths, the confidence intervals, 95% confidence intervals overlap. Quality trout abundance the confidence intervals overlap, and as well as just general trout abundance. So no evidence that haphazard versus undercut is different. The reason that's important is because the undercut method is much more costly, because in order to create those conditions of that undercut bank, it takes a lot more time and preparation to get the logs to fit just perfectly the way you want them to, as opposed to just taking the logs and haphazardly placing them in the channel. So economically, for somebody who's interested in doing restoration, that's very important, because it'll cut their construction costs down dramatically if there's no difference between the haphazard and undercut method. The last thing was, does the introduction of large wood produce sucker holes? Well, according to our density estimates, we just looked at abundance of suckers per 100 foot of pool. Then there was no difference. You can see the 95% confidence intervals overlap completely. However, we looked at biomass of suckers, white suckers. There actually was a 20 times higher number of biomass of white sucker in the wood dominated pools than non-wood. So what that tells us is, yes, we can definitely expect to see more sucker biomass in the wood dominated pools in terms of the numbers of large mature adult fish. So even though density estimates were no different, the numbers of fish, that biomass or pounds of fish was very different, which suggested we had a lot more larger, older, sexually mature white suckers in the wood dominated pools. Fortunately, white suckers are a native species in this environment. So physical chemicals, another one aspect I want to touch on briefly. In the upper Arkansas River, we had a legacy of gold mining and toxic metals. This is showing the mean zinc concentration, when zinc is a very highly toxic metal to trout and salmonids. You can see this trend line shows that there's been a pretty significant decline in zinc from 1994 to 2005. Over approximately the same timeline, you can see what brown trout biomass has done in response to zinc, treating zinc in the system and reducing the amount of zinc in terms of toxic metals in the stream. We see this, you can see this increase in biomass over time, of overall nearly the same time frame. So water quality in terms of physicochemical aspects of stream restoration is super important, and sometimes that's the most limiting factor to a fish population and could give you the biggest bang for your buck. And lastly, biology. This was an approach where monitoring type of study that we looked at for rock versus wood, and we asked what performs best. So looking at project treatments, one of the goals was to develop deep pools for trout to overwinter. And we talked about that earlier, but you can do it with rock, for instance, by using a boulder J-hook structure. This is a boulder structure that helps enhance pools by focusing energy toward the center of the stream and maintaining a deeper pool downstream of the structure. You can build them with rock, or you can do it with wood. In this case, this is a giant fallen, like a spruce tree with root fan, you can see there. And so it's doing the exact same function as the previous structure, but they're using wood instead. Also narrowing over wide channels. This is a vertical kind of eroding bank, and we wanted to stabilize the edge of the channel. So we used cobble material that was imported to provide a bank edge that was resistant to the flow forces, and then planted riparian species, plant species on that bench that we created using that treatment. You can see the grass and willows that are starting to grow on that bench and protect the bank from continually eroding and providing fine sediment source for downstream. So we did that with rock in that case, but we also can do it with wood. Here's an example of the similar bend that had a vertical bank that was covered in Canada thistle, and we wanted to protect the bank and not let it erode continually, providing that fine sediment source. We use wood to stabilize the outer bank. And this is what it looks like afterward, after we planted this with willows and treated the Canada thistle. So now the bank is occupied with willows, and we used wood to stabilize the bank. And the nice thing about the wood is it created about a 2-foot undercut bank. So also improving bank stability. So we can use wood. In this case, this is an overwide channel. We wanted to use some rock to stabilize the edge of this lateral scour bend. So we use boulders and cobble material to stabilize that outside bend. You can see the pools that were created, primarily boulder type of treatment. And then also, you've seen this picture before, we can use wood, and this is an example of tow wood. So what we did is we looked at sites that were using almost entirely wood. So we had electrofishing stations established in the wood-dominated restoration sites. In some locations where we've done almost entirely rock-dominated structures, like I showed you examples of in the blue there. So the green is the wood, blue is the rock, and then the purple is what's representative of the impaired site. If we hadn't done any work at all in this stream system and we left it alone and it was damaged, what would it look like? And here's our results. Brown trout biomass on the y-axis, you can see in the unimproved control, we had about 20 pounds per acre, 25. Up using rock, we got almost to 60 pounds per acre. And then finally, using the wood treatments, we were exceeded over 80 pounds per acre. And those are 95% confidence intervals. So you can see that wood was, in this case, better at achieving our goals of improving trout populations in terms of their biomass. So keys to river restoration projects, you've got to have clearly defined goals. So important to have clearly defined goals and a basic understanding or confidence in what are your limiting factors. And that's kind of the take-home message that I was hoping you guys would get from my talk today. So thank you so much for your time, and I wish I could be there in person to answer your questions, and I hope soon I'll be able to come and visit Chris's class again and do this in person. So thank you very much.